Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, invested in the iron and minerals industries on a large scale, including the construction of the Edmund Fitzgerald, which represented the first such investment by any American life insurance company. In 1957, they contracted Great Lakes Engineering Works of River Rouge, Michigan, to design and construct the ship. The ship's value at that time was $7 million. The SS Edmund Fitzgerald was launched on June 7, 1958. The event was plagued by misfortunes. When Elizabeth Fitzgerald, the wife of Edmund Fitzgerald, tried to christen the ship by smashing a champagne bottle over the bow, it took her 3 attempts to break it. A delay of 36 minutes followed while the shipyard crew struggled to release the keel blocks. When the ship finally launched, it created a large wave that soaked the crowd of 15,000 people. Then it proceeded to hit a pier before righting herself. The sea trials were completed on September 22, 1958. Northwestern Mutual signed a 25-year contract with Olga Bay Norton to operate the vessel. For 17 years, the Edmund Fitzgerald carried taconite from Minnesota's Iron Range mines near Duluth, Minnesota, to steel mills in Detroit, Toledo, and other ports. She set seasonal haul records 6 different times. Loading the Edmund Fitzgerald with taconite pellets took about 4.5 hours, while unloading took around 14 hours. A round trip between Superior, Wisconsin, and Detroit, Michigan usually took her 5 days, and she averaged 47 similar trips per season. By November 1975, the Edmund Fitzgerald had logged an estimated 748 round trips on the Great Lakes and covered more than 1 million miles, a distance roughly equivalent to 44 trips around the world. The Edmund Fitzgerald left on her final voyage from Superior, Wisconsin at 2:15 p.m., headed for Zug Island in Detroit, Michigan. She was carrying 26,535 tons of taconite ore pellets and soon reached her full speed of 16.3 miles per hour. Around 5 p.m., the Edmund Fitzgerald joined the Arthur M. Anderson that was captained by Jesse B. Bernie Cooper and headed for Gary, Indiana. The weather forecast was not unusual for November, and the National Weather Service predicted that a storm would pass just south of Lake Superior by 7 a.m. on November 10th. The SS Wilfred Sykes loaded opposite the Edmund Fitzgerald at the Burlington Northern Dock Number 1 and departed at 4:15 p.m., about 2 hours after the Edmund Fitzgerald. In contrast to the NWS forecast, Captain Dudley J. Paquette of the Wilfred Sykes predicted that a major storm would directly cross Lake Superior. From the outset, he chose a route that took advantage of the protection offered by the lake's north shore to avoid the worst effects of the storm. The crew of the Wilfred Sykes followed the radio conversations between the Edmund Fitzgerald and the Arthur M. Anderson during the first part of their trip. The NWS altered its forecast at 7 p.m., issuing gale warnings for the whole of Lake Superior. The Arthur M. Anderson and the Edmund Fitzgerald altered course northward, seeking shelter along the Ontario shore, where they encountered a winter storm at 1 a.m. on November 10th. The Edmund Fitzgerald reported winds of 52 knots and waves 10 feet high. Captain Paquette of the Wilfred Sykes reported that after 1 a.m., he overheard McSorley say that he had reduced the ship's speed because of the rough conditions. Paquette said that he was stunned to later hear McSorley, who was not known for turning aside or slowing down, state that we're going to try for some lee from Isle Royale. At 2 a.m. on November 10th, the NWS upgraded its warnings from gale to storm, forecasting winds of 35 to 50 knots. Until then, the Edmund Fitzgerald had followed the Arthur M. Anderson, which was traveling at a constant 12 knots, but the faster Edmund Fitzgerald pulled ahead at about 3 a.m. As the storm center passed over the ships, They experienced shifting winds, with wind speeds temporarily dropping as the wind direction changed from the northeast to south, and then northwest. After 1:50 p.m., when the Arthur M. Anderson logged winds of 50 knots, wind speeds again picked up rapidly, and it began to snow at 2:45, reducing visibility. The Arthur M. Anderson lost sight of the Edmund Fitzgerald, which was about 16 miles ahead at the time. Shortly after 3:30 p.m., Captain McSorley radioed the Arthur M. Anderson and reported that the ship was taking on water and had lost two vent covers and a fence railing. The vessel had also developed a list. Two of the Edmund Fitzgerald's six bilge pumps ran continuously to just charge the water. McSorley said that he would slow his ship down so the Arthur M. Anderson could close the gap between them. In a broadcast shortly afterward, the United States Coast Guard warned all shipping that the Soo locks had been closed and they would have to seek safe anchorage. Shortly after 4:10 p.m., McSorley called the Arthur M. Anderson again to report a radar failure and asked the Arthur M. Anderson to keep track of them. The Edmund Fitzgerald, effectively blind, slowed again to let the Edmund Fitzgerald come within a 10-mile range so she could receive radar guidance from the other ship. At 4:39, McSorley contacted the United States Coast Guard station in Grand Marais, Michigan, to inquire whether the Whitefish Point light and navigation beacon were operational. The Coast Guard replied that their monitoring equipment indicated that both instruments were inactive. McSorley then called any ships in the Whitefish Point area to report the state of the navigational aids. He got an answer from Captain Cedric Woodward of the Avafors between 5 o'clock and 5:30 p.m. that the Whitefish Point light was on, but the radio beacon was off. Sometime later, McSorley told Woodward, "I have a bad list. I've lost both radars, and I am taking heavy seas over the deck in one of the worst seas I've ever been in." Approximately 7:10 p.m., when the Arthur M. Anderson notified the Edmund Fitzgerald of an upbound ship and asked how she was doing, McSorley reported, "We are holding our own." The crew was never heard from again. 10 minutes later, the Arthur M. Anderson lost all radar contact with the Edmund Fitzgerald. No distress call was ever sent out. Captain Cooper reported the Edmund Fitzgerald missing at 9:03 p.m. Around 9 p.m., the Arthur M. Anderson was asked to turn around and search for survivors by the Coast Guard. The Anderson was joined in the search by the William Clay Ford. Aircraft joined the search later along with the buoy tender Woodrush. Although the search recovered debris, including lifeboats and rafts, none of the crew were found. On her final voyage, Edmund Fitzgerald's crew of 29 consisted of the captain, the first, second, and third mates, 5 engineers, 3 oilers, a cook, a wiper, 2 maintenance men, 3 watchmen, 3 deckhands, 3 wheelsmen, 2 porters, a cadet, and a steward. Most of the crew were from Ohio and Wisconsin. The ship sank just 17 miles from safety. A United States Navy Lockheed P-3 Orion, piloted by Lieutenant George Connor and equipped to detect magnetic anomalies, found the wreck on November 14, 1975, in 530 feet of water. The wreck lies about 15 miles west of Deadman's Cove, Ontario, about 8 miles northwest of Pancake Bay Provincial Park, and 17 miles from the entrance to Whitefish Bay to the southeast. From May 20th to 28th, 1976, the United States Navy dived on the wreck using its unmanned submersible Curve 3 and found the Edmund Fitzgerald lying in two large pieces in 530 feet of water. The bow section stood upright in the mud, some 170 feet from the stern section that lay capsized at a 50-degree angle from the bow. Many dives were done since then, including one to recover the bell and replace it with a replica. During that expedition, a diver placed a beer can in the pilot house. During a dive in 1994, the remains of a crew member were found alongside the bow of the ship. The rest of the crew are believed to be entombed in the ship. Now, nobody knows why the ship sank exactly. However, there are theories that could possibly lead to an answer. I have combined many different aspects of the final voyage and the wreck to come up with what I think happened. The ship hit a rock a few miles north of the 6 Fathom Shoal, puncturing a hole in the hull. At 3:15 p.m., officers from the Anderson saw the Fitzgerald go over this area. At 3:30 p.m., 15 minutes later, McSorley reported topside damage and stated that he had both bilge pumps running. At 4:10 p.m., McSorley reported that both radars were out. Between 5:30 and 6 p.m., McSorley told the Swedish ship Avafors the following: "I have a bad list, lost both radars, and am taking heavy seas over the deck. One of the worst seas I've ever been in." Sometime around 7 p.m., Captain Cooper of the Arthur M. Anderson reported that his ship was hit by two 30 to 35-foot seas, one burying the aft cabins and damaging a lifeboat. The second wave of this size, perhaps 35 feet, came over the bridge deck. Cooper went on to say that these two waves continued in the direction of the Edmund Fitzgerald and would have struck about the time she sank. At 7:10 p.m., the Anderson called the Fitzgerald to inform them of an approaching vessel. The conversation went as follows: "Fitzgerald, this is the Anderson. Have you checked down?" "Yes, we have." "Fitzgerald, we are about 10 miles behind you, and gaining about 1.5 miles per hour." "Fitzgerald, there is a target 19 miles ahead of us, so the target would be 9 miles on ahead of you." "Well, am I going to clear?" "Yes, he is going to pass to the west of you." "Well, fine. By the way, Fitzgerald, how are you making out with your problem?" "We are holding our own." "Okay, fine. I'll be talking to you later." This was the last anyone heard from the 29 crew members on the Edmund Fitzgerald. At 7:15 p.m., the Fitzgerald entered a squall and is obscured from observation by the Anderson's radar. This was normal during squalls. At 7:20, the Edmund Fitzgerald disappeared from the Anderson's radar. This is around when the large waves that Anderson encountered would have hit the Edmund Fitzgerald.